Hey y'all, welcome back for another flip video. We're back again this week with exploration. Exploration is really talking about the time period between 1400 and 1700 in which the New World was opened up to all of Europe. The essential questions that we'll be focusing on in this video are: how has exploration and migration been a product of economic, technological, social, and political innovation? And then what impact did explorers have on native populations in the Americas? Golden Hawk historians will evaluate the successes of technology on advancing exploration and analyze the impact that explorers had on the New World socially, politically, and economically. While you're watching, make sure that you're taking notes in either Cornell or outline format, as we've talked about in class. It's okay if you have to pause or rewind the video to make sure that you understand all the information and you're getting good notes down. Make sure you get all those bolded and underlined terms. The Renaissance had really inspired a spirit of discovery and innovation in Europe. They were motivated by three things: God, gold, and glory, the three G's. Some explorers were inspired by their faith, and they sought new lands to spread that faith. They went there as missionaries in order to convert people to Christianity mostly. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation had left Christians with this brand new desire to spread their faith as far as possible. Many explorers had also heard stories of treasures of far-off lands, promises of copious amounts of gold, and a lot of people had experienced them for themselves when other traders brought back luxury goods such as silk, perfume, and other precious metals. Some other explorers also sought glory because they wanted their name in lights when they found a new route to a long sought-after location, or better yet, they discovered brand new lands for themselves. Some of the advances in technology that had occurred during the Renaissance were brought to Europe through trade with other nations such as the Chinese or the Muslims. For example, trade with the Muslims brought the astrolabe, which allowed sailors to navigate using the stars as their guide. With the addition of the astrolabe, sailors would now be able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. They also could tell their general direction by the invention of the compass. There was other advances in shipmaking that allowed for sailors to travel farther and quicker. Larger ships that had a deeper hull, called deep draft ships, allowed ships to withstand higher waves, which would make them safer during storms, and also gave them larger cargo holds so they could carry some more supplies from the New World. The caravel was also a new addition to the sailing family, and it was able to travel lighter and quicker, and was highly maneuverable. It also had a rudder and triangular sails that allowed it to go farther without less stuff. Portugal was one of the first nations to start the trade and moving and exploring across the world. It was led largely by Prince Henry, who became known as Henry the Navigator. He wasn't an explorer himself, but he really supported people who did explore. He sent explorers to the islands in the Atlantic and Africa to seek treasures from those areas. He wanted mainly to find a water route to India that they had been trading with to get major spices. So Bartholomew Diaz was the first to accomplish that goal by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and making his way up to India. Vasco da Gama also set out for India, stopping along the African coast to trade, and he was really successful at setting up different colonies and trading centers there. The Spanish were also known and eager to find new routes to the riches of the East, India, China, and in the island nations that were there. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had agreed to pay for the voyage of Christopher Columbus. He set out to sail west to get to India instead of the traditional eastward route. He was after that glory, y'all. When he reached the islands off the coast of the Americas, he called the people there Indians because he believed that he had reached the East Indies. He returned with exotic items like gold and parrots and jewels. But it wasn't until Amerigo Vespucci sailed to the coast of South America that he realized that Christopher Columbus didn't discover India. He discovered America, which is why we now name it after Amerigo Vespucci. The Spanish didn't realize until Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe that they would need to cross the Americas in order to get to India. You can see in the histogram on your right, Christopher Columbus, day 17, no land yet, #ocean view. The other nations that tried to travel were English, French, and Dutch. The Dutch is kind of where the Netherlands is for your geographic knowledge. John Cabot was the first to lead a first major English exploration to Canada. He believed also, just like Columbus, that he had reached Asia, but the English later realized that they discovered a new land, which they called Newfoundland, because they found new land. Get it? Ha. The English led a follow-up voyage by Sir Francis Drake that went around the tip of South America. He was able to make it all the way to California before he was able to circumnavigate the globe, meaning that he made it all the way around the world in order to return to England. Next, Henry Hudson set sail for England, trying to discover a passage that would connect England with India without having to travel all the way around South America. He ended up in the Hudson River in New York, but there was nothing but ice, so he returned back to America and later on to London. Jacques Cartier was the first French voyager to travel deep into Canada, and he claimed that area as New France for the French. Here you can see a map of the different European explorers. You can see Hudson up in the top right-hand corner, Cabot, de Verrazano, Hudson again, Columbus, and here we go Pizarro, Magellan circumnavigated the Robe. We got Da Gama and Diaz. Magellan died. Okay, we got all these different people moving around the world. Now, once they got to the New World, people had to start to scramble to colonize their lands in order to claim it for economic gain. Okay, so the Spanish were able to establish the encomienda system, or a system in which a colonist was given a certain amount of land and a number of Native Americans to work the land for him. Because the idea was you can build a farm, you make land off of it, and then that money goes back to Spain. Okay, the colonist is required in exchange for the Native Americans to teach them about Christianity, but the colonists treated Native Americans awful. They exposed them to serious diseases. They worked them too hard. They were just not nice to them. Parts of the New World were established as colonies in which a conquistador, or a military leader that fought against native peoples to conquer the area, and then they used it for economic purposes. The conquistadors had several advantages over the natives because they had metal weapons, they had guns, they had horses, they were faster, they were stronger. And the most famous conquistador was Hernan Cortez, who conquered the Aztecs, and then also Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incas. The colony's economy was based mainly on mining gold and silver that were built by using Native American workers. It wasn't until Bartolomé de las Casas sought protection for the Native Americans, and he suggested using African slaves, which led to the African slave trade. Early on during exploration, the Spanish and the Portuguese signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew an imaginary line through the Atlantic, dividing the area in half, in which the Spanish and Portuguese would be allowed to explore. Now, most of the land on the left side of the treaty line was undiscovered. They didn't even know that it was there. And so the Portuguese really kind of got screwed over there. They got all that land that hadn't been discovered yet, and the Portuguese got Brazil. That was it. That was all they got, was Brazil. The French settled in New France, otherwise known as what we call now Canada. There wasn't any gold or silver in Canada, but there was a whole bunch of animals that led to a big supply of fur. And so a lot of fur traders settled there. They didn't build colonies and permanent establishments like the other colonies did, but instead they only sent people there to get the furs and then bring them back to France. The furs got them so much money. Once the explorers were there, they tried to push as far westward as possible, trying to claim more and more land. They were also the first to discover the Mississippi River and use it for trade. And so the Mississippi River originally was a part of the French Empire. The Dutch colonists were more interested in establishing trade than really putting populations in their conquered lands. The only Dutch colony was New Netherlands, which is now modern-day New York. They established Manhattan Island and the city of New Amsterdam, which is what today New York City is. They were more focused on developing their colonies in other parts of the world, like Africa, that were more profitable for them. The English set out to establish new colonies in the New World in Jamestown, which failed because there was really cold, they didn't have enough food, and everybody died. The second group of colonists were the Pilgrims, who wanted to establish a new colony because they had been discriminated against in England. Unlike other explorers, the English didn't really trust the natives, and so they're going to have strained relations. But you'll learn all about that when you get to American history. The English and the French got into conflict over the boundaries between the two colonies because the English kept moving farther and farther west and were trying to colonize in the areas that the French had previously claimed. So the French and the English, along with their Native American allies, fought for their right to this land, and therefore it became called the French and Indian War. The French surrendered and gave English Canada and all of the land east of the Mississippi, but they still wanted that Mississippi River so they could bring their furs down and get them back to France. The contact with the two groups, the colonists and the natives, led to a widespread exchange, cultural exchange, economic exchange of plants, animals, and disease that became known as the Columbian Exchange. Over time, the impact of the exchange of foods allowed people in Europe to live longer because they had more food and better food that kept them going for longer, like potatoes and corn. But the spread of disease was most disastrous to the Native Americans. They didn't have the natural resistance that the Europeans had built up over hundreds of years to smallpox, measles, influenza, and malaria. And so millions of the Native Americans died due to exposure to these diseases, and a number grew with each new expedition that arrived. Here you can see the different things that were traded from Europe. They brought diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough, things that would like really kill you. Then they brought a lot of livestock. For example, cattle and horses weren't in the Americas before the colonists came. They gave onions, honeybees, wheat, bananas, olives, and coffee. Coffee was the big thing. And from the Americas, they brought tobacco, turkeys, squash, avocados, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, things that we live off of on a pretty regular basis and have become staples of their new diet. The founding of the colonies led to introduction of new goods in Europe and significant changes in the economy. Their economy was now based on mercantilism, an economic principle that a nation's strength was dependent upon its wealth, that was measured by the amount of gold and silver that the nation possessed. For example, mercantilists could build wealth in two ways. One, you get more and more and more and more and more gold, or two, you are able to export more goods than you are importing, which means you have a favorable balance of trade. If you achieve a favorable balance of trade through tariffs, because you can reduce the number of imports that you're getting, or you can encourage more exports, or you can get more raw materials and have a little bit of both. The colonies allowed countries to access the raw materials that they would need for the exports. During this time, capitalism expanded. It's an economic system in which private individuals and organizations get a profit. As the demand for new goods increased, the prices increased, and so did the opportunity for wealth. Travel to the New World was really expensive, though, so some people got together and they invested in what they called a joint stock company, in which they would buy shares of the stock of a company, and then they would share the profits that they earned. The first joint stock company, and the most famous one, is the East India Company that was used to import spices from Asia. Due to the shortage of labor in the New World, they began the Atlantic slave trade in order to get new laborers. The European needed workers for their plantations or the estates where their cash crops were being grown. The Europeans had used Native Americans, but they all died, and then they had used indentured servants, but they were expensive, and so they began getting slaves from Africa. The captured Africans became a part of the triangular trade, or the exchange of goods between Europe, Africa, and the New World that made a literal triangle of trade. The Middle Passage, or the route that traveled between Africa and the New World, brought the Africans to the Americans to be sold as slaves. The Middle Passage was terrifying. The captive Africans were chained together, and they were forced into small, dark quarters. The journey lasted 3 to 6 weeks, and as many as 10 to 20% of the captive Africans died. When they got there, most of the Africans lived and worked on plantations. The owners inflicted a lot of mental and physical damage. Laws were enacted to make slaves stay as property. The slaves often turned to religion or focused on their home cultural traditions in order to stay hopeful and kind of stay mentally sane because they were being treated so awfully. Some slaves revolted because they slowed down their work or they purposely damaged equipment, but the slave trade was continued for over 400 years and affected as many as 20 million Africans. Millions and millions of more Africans died at the hands of the trade or brutal ownership. The slave traders also kind of damaged Africa as a continent because the people that they were capturing were the youngest generations, which affected the future leadership of those communities. They also divided many African communities because they started capturing other Africans to sell because that was the most profitable thing. The African slaves did contribute to the growth of mercantilism and agriculture in the colonies, but the question you have to ask here is, at what expense? Make sure that you read back over your notes and that you have all the necessary vocabulary. Thanks for joining me for this video, and I'll see you in class.